Hey folks, welcome back to Canada's Boxing Channel. I hope everyone's doing well. Another roasting day, and I was taken into town as well today. Fortunately, I was supervised, so I didn't really have to do much interaction, just stand there and sort of possibly look a little bit grumpy pushing a shopping trolley around. But hey ho, back now. Beautiful afternoon, and the creek is definitely calling our name. But before that, I thought I would spend a little bit of time talking about the metrics or the variables that I use when assessing a fighter, particularly when it comes to this all-time great sort of category. It sparked a little bit of emotional and heated discussion when on a video I uploaded, I guess it was yesterday, I was talking about whether or not Alexander Usyk was an all-time great. And I said, really, it depends upon the metrics you use. Also, I don't like to do it when a fighter is still active because one simply doesn't know. I mean, a fighter could carry on for another 5, conceivably even 10 years, amassing a whole bunch of losses, which would then maybe be deleterious to that fighter's legacy. On the other hand, a fighter like Usyk could retire tomorrow and we would view it differently, right? In comments, I've referred people back to my series that I did on my one guy's opinion, all-time top 10 heavyweights, where I outlined in some detail the metrics or variables that I used. But I thought it was worth possibly, going over them again and trying to really explain that this isn't, it's not a bad thing when I say it depends upon the metrics you use. So let's just stick with Usyk for a moment before I get into the metrics. Let's say, for argument's sake, that you're a massive Alexander Usyk fan, which, by the way, I am. And you decide, okay, the most important thing for me is champions beaten on the road. And you assign a numerical value for that. Let's say you assign 100. And you look at Alexander Usyk and he checks all these boxes and you say, okay, I'm going to give him maximum marks, 100. And then somebody else would have fewer champions beaten on the road and they get a percentage of that 100. If that's your only metric, then it might well be the case that you say Alexander Usyk is the greatest of all time. And I'm happy for you. That's your metric and your results. Somebody else might say total number of title defenses is the most important. And then you'd have to ask that person, do you mean combined championship reigns? Or do you mean, during an individual championship reign? And you narrow it down, right? And then you might end up with a name like Joe Louis or Vladimir Klitschko or somebody else, right? And if that's your only metric, great. I'm happy for you. If you said, the most important thing for me is the total number of fights it took a fighter to get to be heavyweight champion of the world, you might end up with Leon Spinks. And again, if that's the only metric you use, great. I have no issue with you. But it's frankly asinine to say, well, I don't care what metrics you use because fighter X is clearly an all-time great, and so you can shove your metrics up where the sun doesn't shine. That's not a really grown-up way of having a discussion, right? We should be having a discussion about the way we calculate things. So let me go over what I used, right? And I'm not saying that these are, by any stretch of the imagination, the only metrics you can use. They're just mine. So the results I get are going to depend upon these. So, and I'm not going to go over all of them, but combined championship reigns. So how many days was a fighter a world champion? Add them all together and assign a numerical value. I recommend 100. And then the next person down gets a percentage of that, right? Another metric I use is individual reign. Like, how many days was this fighter champion? Unbroken, contiguous days. In that case, it's Joe Louis, right? I also then, and this is where you have to be subjective, you have to do a lot of reading and you have to sift the evidence. Evidence is important, right? You sift the evidence. I say the biggest fight that the person was involved with is a metric that I use. And so you're left often then sort of thinking, well, was Joe Louis the rematch with Max Schmeling when the entire country, plus, remember the time, a long time before civil rights, the weight of the entire African-American race was on the shoulders, the immense pressure was on the shoulders of Joe Louis, who had been beaten by Max Schmeling. He was fighting Max Schmeling to really preserve the heavyweight championship of the world in the Western democracies rather than it go to Nazi Germany. The President of the United States placed a call to Joe Louis along the lines of "Don't let us down." I mean, what an immense pressure. Was that the most important fight that a fighter was involved with? Or was Ali's fight against Frazier, the fight of the century, more important? You decide if that's a metric you want to use, and then you get to decide where in these most important fights fit, and you assign a value to that. The quality of opponents beaten. One way to assess it is look how many Hall of Famers a person beat. Another way might be to say, how many people were world champions when this fighter beat them? So is, for example, Ali's beating of Joe Frazier or George Foreman, is that worth more than Rocky Marciano's beating of Joe Louis? Right? You decide. You decide if that's a metric you want, and then you do your research, do your work, and assess this. When you go way back, like if you're going back to Jack Johnson, John L. Sullivan, Jim Jeffries, then you've got to rely upon newspaper reports. You've got to rely upon peers, because none of us were alive and there's no footage, right? We can easily see, George Foreman, yes, he beat Joe Frazier. We can look at it. We can read about it. I was alive. I remember the fight. But when Jack Johnson beat Jim Jeffries, you got to do work. This is not an easy exercise to do. It's really interesting, but it's not easy to do, which is why sometimes I get a little bit grumpy when people just dismiss it, shove your metrics up your, because, okay, if you don't want any metrics, then you're just going to be forever bouncing around to the next great thing, right? Think about the public or societal impact a fighter had. Was Jack Johnson more of an impactful figure, or was Deontay Wilder? I say that latter one with tongue firmly in cheek, okay? Are firsts important to you? If they are, then you assign a value to maybe George Foreman being the oldest heavyweight champion, Mike Tyson being the youngest heavyweight champion, Muhammad Ali becoming the first 3-time lineal champion, Usyk becoming the first undisputed in the 4-belt era. So when you think about all these things, all these mixes, all these ingredients, which you get to pick, and then you get to do the hard work, and you assign a numerical value of, say, 100, because, math isn't my strong suit, right? Assign a numerical value of 100 to each metric or each variable. And if you've got 10, well, then you'll have a maximum of 1,000 points, right? And you can calculate. I mean, I ended up with 740 something for Joe Louis, which meant that Joe Louis, a fighter who was retired before I was born, became the number one in my work, right? The fighter that I loved as a child and used to fight with my dad about being the best ever, Muhammad Ali, he came second because of the metrics I used, right? Total number of fights. Again, now sometimes you're going to have to sit back and say, this is kind of biased towards older time fighters, because we're never going to see, we're not going to see people have 60, 70, 80, 200 fights anymore, right? Alexander Usyk has a claim to being an all-time great. But if you said the most important thing to me is the total number of fights, he's going to be right at the back of the pack, right? That makes sense, eh? So anyhow, hopefully this addresses some of the emotion, some of the almost anger that I see coming out in the comment section, right? We step back and say, okay, I don't like Bob's metrics. I don't think that Bob's got the right metrics. I'm going to use different metrics. Fair play. Absolutely 100% fair play. As long as you can rationalize the metrics you're using, right? And then explain why you're not using other metrics. So if you decide total number of title defenses is not important, fine. Fill your boots, but maybe ask yourself why. Right? Anyhow, all to say that this isn't really something that people should sort of get emotional about, lose their temper over, certainly not be rude, right? Opinions are simply that. I like to base my opinions on evidence or some defensible variables. If you say to me, well, look, this public or societal impact you talk about, like, really? Why do you think that's important? I can explain why I think it's important. And you could say, okay, I hear you. I disagree, and I'm not going to use that metric. Great. We can shake hands, cheers, all the best. And I really would like then to see your results. And remember, when you start tinkering with your variables, you will get different results. Anybody who's watched the 3 videos I did about the top 10 heavyweights of all time will know that Vladimir Klitschko scored higher than I wanted him to score. And I'm sort of trying to fudge the numbers almost, right? Because I didn't like the outcome. But if you want to be like intellectually sound in your preparation, your work, your outcome, and be able to defend it, then you've got to live with the results. If you select metrics, you've got to live with the answers, right? Anyhow, hopefully this clarifies a few things. And hopefully nobody is going to be telling anybody to be putting things inside their bottoms, because that just seems very unpleasant to me. Thank you very much for watching. Have a lovely day, and I'm off for my afternoon swim. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.